Welcome back to another episode of My Trauma's Chronic, but I'm Iconic. Today we're diving deep into the complexities of empathy and the challenges faced by those who feel deeply in a world that often feels indifferent to suffering. Joining us is a remarkable Benn Wiebe, a film and event producer and social impact strategist, who has dedicated his career to amplifying voices that often go unheard. In this episode, we will explore the profound isolation that empathetic individuals can experience and the emotional toll it takes when it feels like we're shouting into a void. Ben will shed light onto the nuances of complex PTSD and how it impacts not only those who have lived through trauma, but also its efforts to creating change in the world. We discuss the critical battles against apathy and how we can encourage a culture of care that transcends our individual struggles. This conversation is packed with insights, strategies, and hope aimed at empowering you to channel your empathy into meaningful action. So make sure to like, comment, subscribe so we can continue doing the work that we're doing and making an impact on the world. So grab yourself a cup of tea, get cozy, and let's get started. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so my name is Benn Wiebe. I'm originally from the US. I grew up on the West Coast in Oregon and lived in California for a long time. And I live in London. I've lived in the UK for about the past 4 years. My professional background's in film and media and events. Um, and I have complex PTSD and ADD and CFS, which is chronic fatigue. So I carry a lot with me, and I have those conditions mean I have both genetic and acquired neurodiversity. Um, so it's a fun experience to balance all of that.
Yeah, I think as somebody with ADHD, autism, and complex PTSD, and EUPD, yeah, it's chaotic, it's a journey, and there's a lot to balance. Um, you mentioned filming. Can you share with us a little bit about your journey and what led you to focus on filming and the social impact side of things?
Yeah, so I mean, like anything, it's we try to work on what we do what we have to do so that we can eventually do what we want to do, right? I think that's probably true in anything. But so for film, I knew I always wanted to tell stories or help tell people stories, and I think and partly due to my conditions, but also just from someone who has grown up surviving a lot of abuse. Um, uh, and for the record, I always want to make it clear when I talk about abuse, because most people assume when we talk about it that our parents abused us. But in my case, my parents have always been my saving grace. They were my angels, but pretty much from everywhere else. From everywhere else. So I never really thought that my voice mattered or people cared about my story. So I wanted to be a storyteller to like amplify other people, right? Help other people tell their story. So once I started working in film, like I did work on a lot of toxic stuff and seemingly random shows like the Real Housewives franchise or World Poker Tour, which was fun. But then I started working on a show called Intervention, which isn't available in the UK, I don't think, but in the US it's been around for many, many years. And it's about people and their addictions, and it's a docu-series. And the biggest thing I saw in the show working on it was it actually sets up, a real intervention for someone who has, and these are extreme cases, real extreme cases of addiction, people who really need help. And the show will pay for detox and rehab. And within that, though, it was what seemed really powerful to me was it wasn't performative, right? Like the gesture of that wasn't performative. Oh yeah, we're gonna help people with this show, but it's really just for ratings. Like, no, like in the process, even if someone chose to go, but then left the rehab before their time was done, which does happen, the show would still commit to their like they would fulfill their commitment if the person even ever went back, even years later, the show would fulfill that and continue supporting them through the rehab and everything. So that really opened me up to how, media and film could really be powerful. So that was my first introduction to how to do that.
That is such an amazing thing, but a lot of television is toxic, it's exploitive, and tokenistic. And for like a company to get out of that, space and to do something that's very impactful. I mean, like, you know what, even though our contract and our film is over, we'll still honor that. I think that is very unheard of in the media industry.
Yeah.
Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't worked in that place for that long. So yeah.
No, it is. It's, well, you feel this pressure, and it's not an unspoken pressure of everybody wants to do this,
Mm,
right? Like what Meryl Streep says at the end of Devil Wears Prada, everyone wants to be us. Everyone wants to do this. It's, literally a line she has in that movie. You feel that. It's palpable, right? So it's very easy to be exploitive in media because all the people that work in it are sold this kind of facade that, oh, everyone, what we can kind of do what we want and say what we want, whether it's honest or manipulated, because everyone wants to do that. Everyone wants to tune in, you know. So that kind of provides this permission, right? Where now you don't have a responsibility if you're a filmmaker or, or whatever, a producer. Um, and I never agreed with that. We absolutely have a responsibility. Um, so that's, yeah. So that's why shows like Intervention really kind of shocking. They're not common enough, to your point. Yeah.
a lot of the work to do with social impact usually comes from a place of empathy. I
Yeah.
know for me doing my podcast, My Trauma's Chronic, but my chronic, it's coming from a place of empathy, it's coming from a place of lived experience. What experiences in your life have shaped your understanding of empathy?
Oh man. I mean, I love the word empathy. I use it a lot. Because I think the world needs more of it, and I think people have kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of what empathy is, right? I mean, mine comes from the very, very beginning. Like I was bullied terribly as a child. I was soft-spoken. I tried to do the turn the other cheek thing. I also wasn't particularly big. I've never been like a large or like physically intimidating person. And as a guy, that's between other boys, that's always a thing too with kids is, can you stand up for yourself and all that? And yeah, so I always chose to kind of turn the other cheek method, and it didn't particularly work very well. I usually just got more bullied. So I don't know. I feel like I had natural empathy. And my parents really instilled in me to do that, that it matters. Like it's worth it to be led by kindness, right? Regardless of how much the world kind of throws at you.
Mm,
Um, and it doesn't mean things will get easier, right? When we try and live that way. But I always, yeah, was taught that it's like regardless of where we end up, it's worth it to be good to people, and to be led by that. And even if we accomplish nothing else, if we can say that we did that, I think that's a good life. And I have a daughter now who's 11, and I do the same thing. I'm like, even if you fail at things, even if you're frustrated at things, as long as we're led by kindness and we treat people well, like we can always take that with us, no
mm,
matter. So, um, yeah, it's. I yeah, I think we're always what do you a work in progress. Um,
absolutely.
so so that's why I do like talking to people how empathy doesn't necessarily come easy.
Mm.
Uh, right? But it is a constant thing, right? Like I mean, some of the most uncomfortable conversations work because they're driven by empathy, which is why people have a hard time going to dark places or having hard conversations, right? If it's hard for them to kind of find the empathy in that.
I think empathy is something that is, yeah, very, very difficult, like you said. I think empathy, you know, I think it's is instilled in people, majority most of the time, it's instilled in people from a very, very young age, you know. But like as life gets more and more complex, as you experience more things, life is not as easy to do, you know? And it's difficult. I feel like empathy, like especially we're going to talk about this later, but like with trauma, once you experience a certain level of trauma, your empathy, you can be empathetic, but for in some cases your empathy is high. In when I say empathy is high, it's a high criteria for you to meet for me to give you my empathy.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
I've gone through so much, I'm like, ooh, you are reacting to this like it's a big problem, but for me it's and to like navigate that. Well, no.
Yeah. Yes. I feel that. It's pretty visceral. Like I end up because I place empathy as a really important trait for everyone. That's kind of my barometer for how to not judge people, but how to kind of like weigh, you know, like who they are and what their dynamic is with you. And so yeah, so my bar ends up feeling very high, probably at times to an unrealistic degree,
Mm,
right? Expecting other people to kind of match that. And even when you meet another empathetic person or you feel like you're both kind of empaths in a way, that also doesn't make it easier because then you can kind of that empathy can kind of bleed and you take on the baggage of other people too. And then it can be hard to even discern like what's coming from you and what's coming from the other person because you're kind of blending your experiences and it's like when you would fight for someone else when you really have nothing to do with it like it's like what's happening doesn't necessarily directly affect you but you feel like you want to stand up and fight for another
mm,
person and then it feels like well why would you put because I think the typical response would be well why would you put yourself at risk right why would you sacrifice anything when you have so little to benefit right?
mm,
In incentive for someone. I think that's a tricky thing about empathy is, well, then how can we say we care about what it is to be in someone else's shoes
mm.
if we're not willing to go there, regardless of if we necessarily benefit, right?
And that's so interesting because it kind of intersects, right, with ADHD, or what you have is ADD. I have ADHD. Our sense of justice is
Yeah.
very high. People call it justice sensitivity. And for those who don't know what that means, it means that we, individuals with ADHD, are more acutely aware and reactive to perceived injustices, so
Yeah.
potentially leading to stronger emotional and behavioral responses. So that refers, when we notice something and we identify wrongdoing and an injustice, we have really, really intense cognitive, emotional, and behavioral reactions to that injustice. And we're like, usually be like, face, like, go head in and be like, yeah, no, that's not right. Without thinking of the consequences, oh, how is this going to affect me if I get involved or stuff like that. I don't know if that's the case for you,
Oh
but
man.
yeah.
I've done yes, I have done that a lot. And the jump, you said it perfectly. The kind of diving right in, being willing to either stick up for something or someone or just making it be more noticeable. Hey, there's something wrong there. People should be paying attention to that. I've done that so many times. It has led to me being ostracized in certain
Mm,
groups. I've lost opportunities. I've been let go from jobs for doing that too, right? It's you know, because from some perspectives it's well now you're a liability. You're willing to dig and you're willing to vet harder than other people will, what's going on or behaviors of other people. And we don't necessarily need that happening here in order for the status quo to keep going. Right. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're right all the time, right?
mm,
Maybe not all things warrant our, social justice, emphasis. But it is hard when I know for me, it always feels like it's warranted, uh, right? And
yeah.
so it is hard to know that because you feel like there's a not a righteousness, right? But that you're like the intent is what's noble
Mm,
in it.
yeah.
It is hard to be for someone else to say, maybe this time you're wrong, and to ever feel like you might
Mm,
be wrong,
yeah.
right? So, and that is a dangerous place sometimes to live in because then how do you ever know if you're wrong? Um,
Mm,
I don't necessarily feel I've been wrong. In most of the times I've stood up in that way. I just know I have been penalized a
mm,
lot for doing it. Because and there's so many movies about this too, right? Oh, if someone stands up and says, "I'll take the brunt of the damage," right? I'll be the tank, for a good gamer reference. I'll be the tank and I'll take the most damage for the team. I think your average person, not to judge people en masse, but I think a typical human response is if that person is willing to take damage, let them. It makes me safer, which is why it's hard to find other people who will stand up with you and be like, you know what, you're right. Like, we should fight for that. That's not okay. Or what's happening to that person's not okay. Right. I have found it rare to find people who would stand beside me and fight for the same arguments.
I feel like I experienced that with my autism. I have autism and ADHD. And with my autism, I have very black and white thinking.
Hmm.
It's like, I'm right. I know I'm right. I feel this level of whatever it is. And I know that in my, like, soul, in my brain, this is wrong. I need to deal with it. And, I will speak up. I would do whatever I see fit. And that doesn't mean like go do murder, maybe. But like, it means like, um, yeah, it's not just about going and it's about addressing something. I think from when people have failed to address things for you, you know the pain, you know the suffering. You're like, I'm not going to let that happen. I'll be the person that I wish I had. I don't know. That's something. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's other people that can relate to that. I know there's other people that can relate to that. Um, in your work, how do you define empathy?
I mean, I think I actually was in a group conversation recently about what makes good leadership. And
Mm,
when the moderator said, let's start by giving one word, and I said compassion, and everybody else in the group said that's an interesting take. They didn't disagree, but their initial response was that's interesting, which tells me right off the bat that that's not a take they're used to hearing, right? That compassion or empathy are leading places to come from in what makes good leadership. And that's insane to me. Like, I think uh, in my work, I would rather people be less productive and highly empathetic so that your workplace, what you're nurturing in a workplace with a team, is one that actually has trust and care in it. I mean, the average person doesn't even stay at a job now for more than 2 years.
Mm.
I think it's less than 2 years now. Like the average keeps just going down. So if you hear someone being like, I've been at the same company for 10 years, that used to be something you would hear more common. That's super rare now. Um and I think part of that is we are asking more questions and expecting more empathy. We are expecting more of a values-driven environment in our workplace. And when we don't get it, it's like I'll just move on. I'm not going to be treated like someone who's just told to shut up and do my work and don't bring anything from out the outside in or don't share any vulnerabilities. So I've tried to do a lot of work in terms of advocating for that, for what a healthier work environment looks like, and how that trickles down into the actual things we make and put out into the world, especially in media and film and games and such. I worked for the games mental health charity for a while called Safe in Our World. So I actually had to go in to companies, like game companies, big and small, and say like, I'm here to get dirty in the trenches with you and see where, any of the toxic elements are and help you figure it out. Like, let's figure it out together, not demonize, but let's find some solutions. And even then you see this response that just runs the gamut, right? And I'm fine like naming companies that were good and ones that weren't. I mean, when I went to Ubisoft, which a lot of people know, they make big games, Call of Duty and Just Dance and stuff. And when I approached them, they were like, you're right. We've been trying to figure out how to reduce toxicity. They even had executives get in trouble for like sexual harassment and all that. But they didn't shy away. They're like, no, you're right. This is good that you're here. Let's have some real good talks. And I was like, let's figure out how to be preemptive versus reactive all the time. And it led to designing some things like the Good Game Book, which they now present to all their players and things like that. But I had the same verbatim intro conversation to Electronic Arts, which makes, FIFA and Need for Speed and all kinds of stuff, right? Another big games company. They had the exact opposite response. They said, how dare you? We don't have a problem. We don't have a reputation problem. People love working here, blah, 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 right? Nope. They have very public articles you can find. Same thing at the executive level. Problems with toxic workplace, sexual harassment, all kinds of stuff. Women being discriminated against, over men, right? Yeah, all kinds of stuff. So it's not like a company like that can hide it, that there's clearly issues that need addressing, but they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it because, so I've been on this train of like, how do we shape a healthier, environment for any workplace, and what does healthy even look like? Because clearly that's different for everyone in some way,
Absolutely.
right? And then people get shy. They think when we say, what does healthy look like? I've asked entire rooms because I've given some talks at conferences and such. And I'll say, what does healthy look like to you guys? And people will be shy to raise their hand, I think, because they assume, and I love talking about like people assume without asking questions, but so people assume there's one right answer, and there's not. It's nuanced, right? But it has to be a conversation. What does it look like? And I just don't think we talk about it enough with each other.
Yeah. I think for me, I know that every few months, my definition of healthy changes.
Yeah,
And I feel like with more like all these different experiences I'm facing, every day is a new experience. People think you have to go through a massive change for it to be an experience. Every day you're experiencing something. If you're opening a door, that's an experience. If you're, texting, that's an experience. Everything is an experience, and everything I process is shaping my definition of things. And I feel like people are often afraid to question authority. Like if we go back to, thing. And I'm like, but that is a healthy thing to do.
sure.
People may not want to do it, but it's a healthy thing to do. Healthy looks like collaboration, you know? healthy looks like having conversations. I know in the borough that I'm a care leaver, but I work for the borough that um um that looks after me,
Hmm.
and I have a really good relationships with people on top tier management positions. However, people who are on the third managerial level have an issue with it because
Mhm.
they think I get to say certain things. For example, there was this guy. Okay, let's say he's executive director for children's family and schools or whatever. He's executive director. We were doing writing to the child. It's a policy that we want to bring in. So any sort of document or any reports are written to the child. So when they are grown up and they request their files, it feels like it's written to them for them to understand. It's personal. Anyway, so he, like the executive director, wrote a manifesto. Anyway, we were in another meeting. The executive director wasn't there. My line manager was there, and there was a few key managerial people for the project that was also there. Very senior, second level, so just below this executive director. There was a quote from the manifesto that they wanted to include. They said it wasn't appropriate for the parents or carers one. It's just not needed. It's not like it's not appropriate. It just doesn't need to be there. And I said, well, it doesn't need to be there on the professional one either. That's all I said. I didn't say anything more. I didn't say anything less. I just said it doesn't even need to be in the professional one. And everybody looked at each other, but other people were looking at each other like, yeah, actually, she's right. My line manager was like, gave me a look, and I was like, what's the matter? He said, no, not everybody has a close relationship with so and so. Like it was saying, like, we're much closer. And I'm like, in my head, I was like, it's not about the fact that I'm close with that person. It's about if it doesn't need to be there, it doesn't need to be there. For me, your email signature doesn't define what I'm going to say about you or about your work. If it
Right.
doesn't need to be there, it doesn't need to be there. And I would, I think that's what makes top management like me because I don't care who they are. Like I understand the hierarchy, but I don't. I'm very empathetic with what their roles are, what the responsibilities are. They have to act a certain way because they have their own agendas. But I will interact with them like I would interact with anybody else.
Yeah. And that's not a small thing,
Yeah.
right? It's because then I think to your point, they can sense that you're not over curating what you have and want to say to them,
Hmm.
right? It's which I mean, I've been in that position and I've been an employer a bit, uh, and you do feel the energy can change when
Hmm.
people feel like maybe there's some fear to admit something, regardless of if that's has anything to do with you individually, right? Or it's just
Hmm.
about the hierarchy you hold.
Yeah.
But people always have a fear, right? They don't want, I mean, it's where we were talking about earlier. They if they feel like there's a risk, most people will not take the risk, right? Because it's because you don't know. And if that's a hierarchical risk, right? Oh, I shouldn't say this to a manager or a boss because maybe it makes me look like a liability.
Hmm.
So then you wonder why people are so shy or unwilling to talk about their vulnerabilities at work, right? Even when, and so, and when people see someone like you being very comfortable, with who you are and how you conversate with people regardless of their position, I think there's also some um, maybe envy. I don't know if that's the best word, right? But that others would like to feel that free and they don't because they are worried that um, it will include them showing some of their own vulnerability and they're not willing to do that. They think there will be repercussions. It's like when a company says, "Oh, We have an open door policy, so it's fine to be vulnerable and share. Come, the door is open. Do you think most people trust that invitation? Right? Like, because it's not a two-way commitment. There's no commitment of time. If you came to an open door, but the person said, "Oh, it's actually not a great time," or they're clearly in a meeting or on a phone call, right? You would probably just walk away and be like, "Oh, so much for the open door policy. I came at the wrong time," because there's no dual commitment of time to make it important. So I think companies or bosses will do these things too and say, it's okay. This is safe. It is safe to just be candid, be yourself, right? Whatever that looks like. And then make gestures like open door. But then those gestures will feel disingenuous, which just makes people hide even more of who they are, right? Not less. So it almost does more damage than like not having that at all.
Absolutely. So we've just discussed, the importance of advocacy. We've discussed, why it's crucial in today's society that we, speak out, um, and why empathy is so crucial. And, the isolation that empathy brings. But, you know, when you give that much energy out, or and I don't just mean spiritual energy because it's also very physical. How do you balance that self-care while advocating for others?
Ah, it's really hard. I mean, I have a really good example because I met someone about a year ago. Yeah, it was like almost exactly a year ago. Yeah, who's become really important to me. And we both kind of identified ourselves as being very empathetic people. So we connected a lot through that. But something that quickly, and it was beautiful for a short time. But then I think we both noticed that in kind of championing a high level of empathy, we actually ended up meeting each other more in our pain
Mm,
than anything else, right? And I think that's kind of the flip side, right? Uh where empathy, whether it's in a professional setting or a personal one, can get really hard, right? Because a lot of what it's like when people write reviews for anything, right? A restaurant or movie or whatever. They usually write, some people write when it's really great.
mm,
More people write when it's really bad. The
mm,
most people who write reviews when they're really, really disappointed. The second most popular is when they're very, very happy. And rarely do people do it when they're in the middle. And they're just
mm,
like, it's good. It's fine. Right? Anything that's kind of just sits there, no. So when we talk about empathy too, a lot of the attention ends up going to these very ends of the spectrum places, I think, right? The places where we really feel fulfilled in that empathy. Oh, this feels great. I feel very supported. It's really lovely to see things working, or it's the why aren't things working? And why does it seem like empathetic people, few and far between as it may seem, are the only ones who care? Like, and then to question, are we the only ones who care? It can seem like it, or we're the only ones who care enough, like enough to actually, do something. And so when I've connected someone like her, uh, from kind of like two people being highly empathetic, uh, I think one of the hard things that also ended up happening was you end up oversharing. And I ended up oversharing, like even talking about, things like ideation, right? Like
mm.
like when the empathy reaches that point where you're like, well, if other people, like if we can't get other people to feel that, compassion to a level that we do, like what's the point of all of this? If we feel like we're not able to change anything. And I think that's when ideation can start to easily set in. And I know for me, I started oversharing about how often I was feeling that. And then the other person started feeling like, she verbalized it actually. She said, I'm starting to feel responsible for your ideation. And even in the moment, I didn't respond super great to that. But after the fact, I realized she was right. Right. Like we can't put that on anyone else. And so that is a hard part with the empathy is we don't hide. A lot of us are willing to be more candid and vulnerable as you've shared too, right? That and then it's shocking when we realize most people aren't like that. And most people will, I think the average person would consider that overstepping, right? I mean, how many of us have actually shared our ideation with anyone else? It's rare in most cases
Mm.
because we're afraid for most people, oh, that's sharing too much. You didn't need to tell me that. So yeah, so it is this tricky balance, that I don't have great answers for.
Talking about ideations, yeah. You know what? I feel like I've never experienced myself being, I think, being a child in care.
Yeah.
I feel like people are there to look after me, people are there to care for me, and it never crossed my mind, like, it's overbearing for them. And I feel like, I wonder if, yeah, if and nobody's ever verbalized it's overbearing. Because I feel like they're responsible individuals. They, that's their role. I was on a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1, or even when I was on 5-to-1 with 4 mental health nurses and support worker.
Mm.
This is what they were, you know, supposed to do. Like, I think the dynamics were different.
Yeah.
And I think with my friends or something like that, I don't overshare stuff like that. But then on the other hand, I have felt I've never I don't, maybe I haven't put two and yeah. There's been times where people have told me stuff, and I'm like, this is too much. Like I have a very high tolerance to any information given to me. But then when somebody's saying how much pain, I think it's not that fact that it's overbearing. So I can't do anything. I guess it comes back to responsibility.
Mm.
I can't do anything to ensure your safety. I can't do anything to reduce the pain. My validation of your feeling is not enough. I know it's not enough. What can I do? I can empathize
Yeah.
with the situation. And I think that, there's been a time when I had to tell someone, you know what? I understand you're in pain. I know you're suffering, but I can't be the person to meet your needs. And be like, signpost. I think I've done that a lot of people that's close to me. I'd be like, signpost. I think that's a very professional thing to do, just signpost when you can't deal with something.
Sure.
But that's not. There's nothing in my capacity that I can do to make that feeling go better when it's on a certain level. Um, yeah, and I feel like like if we go to storytelling and films, like that that creates a lot of social change. You know,
Yeah.
uh, if done well, and it can create social change negatively as well.
It can, yeah. I mean, there are many layers that it can, which is why I appreciate it as work. And I mean, I think, yeah, to your point, um, I think that's why right, like stories is such a great vehicle to be able to do that because I had never really thought about it, which is I think a selfish perspective of, and you said it well, when the other person that you're sharing with kind of feels helpless, right? Other than, giving empathy back, if there's not really much you can do to fix it, and it's not really fair to put the onus on someone else, especially if it feels like you're putting it just on them, uh, to kind of help fix
Mm,
the situation. But through stories, yeah, and making films and stuff, I think it allows us to kind of reach an empathy without the pressure of having to have a solution. So I produced a documentary on grieving children
mm,
called Beautiful Something Left Behind. And people didn't want to support it at first, actually, when it was being made, because we weren't interviewing adults. We were interviewing children only. It's not like adults weren't in it, but the adults weren't what it was for. Like that's, they're on the periphery. You hear them, you see them, but they're not the subject. Like they're not there to be interviewed. They're a part of the story, but they're not the story. So, and then the reason for that, which again I was met with like skepticism, was we don't listen to children. Like across the world, every nation, denomination, we don't listen to children.
mm,
So many children, even my own daughter. I think I do a great job. We all think we're the hero of our own story. My own daughter has been like, I don't feel heard. You're not listening to me. you know Meanwhile, I think I'm doing a great job, right? So we all I think we all have experienced that as children to a degree, and as adults we think, even if we think we're great at it, being good to kids, we still don't always succeed in that, right? Um so that's why I thought, I don't necessarily know how to fix this thing of we don't listen to children, but this documentary is powerful. It's a powerful example that can be, amplified and shared out there. And we actually were able to create educational material that's used in, like, I think Denmark and Norway, in their schools to help teach kids, and use the film as a tool about loss and how we deal with that, and what are good, like, mechanisms in response to grief and relief. um so I love having an example like that of how stories can really be powerful, and kind of take us to a place where we're like, well, might feel inept on how to be helpful on this particular issue, but I can help propel this story, though. And this
mm.
story is a powerful way to help people, on that journey that's difficult. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we can look at a very recent example. I've done research into it. I haven't watched it, I got to admit that. But adolescence, you know, empathy and social change seems to be playing, a pivotal role in shaping the narrative, and its impact on the viewers, explores teenage life, highlighting how empathy can foster understanding and that connection and resilience among young people facing, social pressures, identity struggles, and, emotional turmoil. And I think I watched a bit of it, not all of it, but, empathy is portrayed as a crucial tool for bridging divides between characters from different backgrounds, experiences, and belief systems. And it does it by showcasing moments where characters are actively listening, they're validating each other's feelings and offering that support. And I feel like that series encourages viewers to reflect on their own capacity for compassion, which a lot of films don't do. Which even when I was watching, I was like, I'm reflecting, and it's created that journey along with the film. There's moments where empathy can transform into conflict, and then it was meaningful, like, and then they did meaningful dialogue. Not everything has to be, very, like, verbally aggressive or, physical, not talking to each other, that meaningful, healthy dialogue. And I feel like that was a change because it's making us like, think about that social dynamic. But I don't know, have you watched it?
I haven't seen that particular show, but that dynamic makes total sense, right? And it's uh having uncomfortable conversations can drive out both ends of that spectrum, right? It can drive out people meeting you in a place of understanding and challenging them to be good listeners, regardless of if they really understand all of what's being shared, or agree with whatever's being shared. That's not necessarily the point. I love those examples too, because I think we've kind of been taught now by our current apparatus, and both like from political debates to just, how like news shows now are run largely by punditry, not really by your more objective old school journalism, which really were like hosts weren't the story, and they weren't there to give opinions. They were really there to deliver news. So but our new apparatus, our current one really isn't that. So the examples that we have uh, are largely about talking, people talking, opinions being equal to facts, right? So I think there's so much focus on speaking and not listening, are the
Mm.
examples that were given. And to your point, like you can't really find or practice empathy without practicing being a good listener. That's like saying, I'm a great writer, but I don't read. And it's like, I don't know. I don't know if I believe you then. Right? I mean, that's the first question you would probably ask someone who's like, I'm a writer. It's like, oh, what do you read? And they're like, I don't read. Okay, you're probably not much of a writer then. Like the two kind of go hand in hand. So if you're going to say, I have plenty of empathy and compassion, oh, okay. So who do you listen to? What, when or are you a good confidant with your friends? Do your friends, come to you and have good talks because there is a real trust there. They know you're a good listener, right? And if that's not true, then okay, maybe you're not as good a listener as you think you are, right? It's like uh so yeah, I do like seeing those examples. And we also aren't given that many good ones too on what honest discourse and debate looks like either. I think we're kind of told that debate is about winning, and that's all it's about. It's not, that's not what it's about, right? Like it's like you can have a debate and neither of you end up agreeing at all, because that's not necessarily the point. Like the point isn't that, one of you wins and you have to all agree with one take at the end. I think it's as much about compassion. It's no, can we have conversations where regardless of if we agree with the other take, the conversation is allowed to happen and we speak and we listen and we're respectful, right? And there you go. That's good discourse. But I think there's just few examples of how to do that anymore. So we don't know how.
So I'm gonna move on to abuse, which is a bit it's your opinion. So yeah, I will say it like in the question. If you don't answer it, we can just move on.
Yeah.
Um, in your opinion, what are the most pressing forms of abuse and oppression currently affecting communities globally, and how are they interlinked?
So I think I mean, what we see the most, like on the news, when we tune into stories, is where violence, very direct, like physical violence is going on, right? These big, explosive examples, whether that's, the war in Ukraine or, the decimation of Gaza, right? But these are very, very big, explosive examples, but so little do we talk about the kind of, unseen kinds of abuse, right? It's just like how we talk about unseen forms of disabilities.
Mm,
Um, and I think that's psychological and emotional abuse. There's even a component where you can hold people hostage, um, over their life situation,
mm,
right? That's also very invisible. You can do that with work. You can do that with finances, right? I mean, in cultures where particularly women still are dominated by men, where there's still laws that exist that basically say men can do what they want and women can't. We know there's still plenty of places where that's true. Um, yeah, there's just so much unseen abuse because people are not equal and free to exert themselves the way they want to. So even something like your financial situation can be held hostage over you so that you can't leave. You cannot change your situation or improve it.
mm.
And I think
I
that
feel like,
lies,
sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. I just want to add a quick thing. I feel like a good example of that was in the UK. There was, I think she's from Uganda, this Ugandan judge, and she brought somebody. No, she's not Ugandan. She was from a country in Africa. I can't remember. I think it might be Uganda or Uganda helped or whatever. And she is a court judge in her home country.
Mhm.
And she brought somebody over, and she was basically treating them as a slave.
Oh,
Um, and And of course, the person, is stuck in that situation because back home, it might not be safe. There's a lot of
mhm.
corruption. There's no economic stability. And this opportunity in London, with this judge, maybe that's, my broken life, where I can, make sure my children are fed or whatever that a woman, that was enslaved had.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's just a good example. I just wanted to add that in. It was just,
No,
yeah.
but it is a good example, right? And because people have also used that argument of, oh, if you take someone out of a terrible situation and put them in a still terrible situation, but maybe a little bit better, oh, well, you've still improved their situation. They would be worse off if, right? And it's like, but clearly they're still being exploited, right? So we're missing the mark by not paying attention to that. You're giving overcredit. Like I worked for someone for a while, extremely wealthy type person who had private staff and everything, right? And the private staff had clearly been were several people who had been brought over from another country and worked for them for years, many years. But at a function hosted at their like estate, or I don't know what you call it, uh, uh, like a hall or mansion, whatever. But a event hosted at her place, and they were name dropping by name people that were important to them. But when it came to their staff at their house, people they admitted they had known 10, 15, 20 years couldn't even name their names or wasn't willing to in front of other people because they weren't important enough. They weren't important enough. They were simply help for them in their life, and that was that dynamic, and that really told me a lot, right? I mean, not just about that kind of dynamic, but how we so easily um, abuse people, even in ways that seem harmless, right? So in that circumstance, you can say, well, those people are well taken care of. They, right? They have a decent life and a place of work that's stable and blah blah blah. It's like right, but clearly that there's kind of an inhumane treatment of them. If like when we talk about the empathy and being that empathetic person, when I've had a job and I feel like I'm being treated simply as some cog in a machine and a number, and no one really cares at all about you as a person, you're not a person here when you walk in that door. Whenever I have felt that, and I've felt that several times, I've walked. Even if I was broke and I couldn't afford to not have the job, I would be
Mm,
like, this is insane. Like this is clearly abuse, and I would rather I would rather suffer in other ways than to clearly be in a position where I'm being abused and exploited, right? And but those are largely unseen issues, or even if they're seen, they're ignored because they're not as explosive as showing like a war on TV,
Mm.
right? Which is very hard to ignore.
And to be able to leave, having that choice is another level. I feel like it's a privilege. It shouldn't be a privilege, but it is, you know. And I think a lot of people, one thing I think is, I think in my opinion, I think the worst type of abuse is systematic abuse.
Yes.
I had a very abusive situation at home. I was physically, emotionally, verbally, and religiously abused by my parents, my biological parents. I was physically, all of that except religious, and sexually abused by my mother's two brothers.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know what? I put myself into care, everything like that. But I was facing abuse. I just and I didn't realize it because it's a better situation. It took me a while to realize it's a better situation than home. Like I get treated badly, but my well-being is not in danger. In danger in terms of is life or death.
Yeah.
Then you're like, this is not dangerous. This is not uh, just because it looks different and it's better
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's actually better. It just looks different and you're unable to recognize what that is because
Oh,
you're used to an environment for so long.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, the very nature of systematic abuse uh, thrives on that, right? If we like if we're in a situation that we could say is possibly the worst situation we've ever been in, and then someone says, or even if someone doesn't have to say it, but you're introduced to something that's even a little bit better, then the pressure is you should feel grateful because now you're not in the worst of you're not in the worst of two evils, right? It's so I and I think people who commit abuse clearly thrive on that too. Oh, I'll give you breadcrumbs so that you're grateful because you should be thankful I'm not giving you nothing,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And when you're used to being abused, like I mean the kind of abuse I went through um was what drove me to feel like the best descriptors I can describe was from the very beginning in life. I felt inept, inadequate, incapable, unintelligent, right? So when we talk about having a voice, to your point, you don't feel you have one because your power and authority even over yourself has been stripped away from such a young age uh, that then you don't really know what healthy looks like. So you'll kind of take anything. You're like, anything is better than this. So please introduce me to anything other than this, which is how these systematic, things go. And it does program us to be like, oh, we become very grateful people, even if the improvement around us is minuscule. And then we end up not even asking very much of other people, which is, also how it's like, well, how do we keep ourselves from getting into abusive relationships? Well, we've already kind of been programmed to not set the bar very high for how we're treated by other people. This is why it is so dangerous that this kind of abuse or abuses are largely unseen, right? They don't come with big warlike battle scars that are easy for other people to notice. We would have to invite them inside, you know, our whole world for them to then finally see it, right? Like, and unless we do that, and most people don't, because then there's shame. There's shame and guilt. Oh, well, it must partly be my fault. I'm in this. So why would I open up new friends and other people or people I want to respect me or be friends with? Why would I open them up to show them the grime,
Mm,
like the hardest stuff I've had to deal with or the stuff I can't even get away from. I don't even know how, right? Like, yeah, it just creates a vicious cycle. Um, and I'm 41 and I'm still fighting with feeling inept and inadequate. And I don't ask other people for help because people rarely helped me and instead made me feel like I couldn't do things on my own. I wasn't capable of doing anything or wasn't particularly good at anything. So then what does it do? It makes you incessantly want to do things by yourself, which means now I don't ask for help ever, which is stupid.
true. I feel like it's really the societal structures that perpetuate that cycle of abuse and oppression,
Yeah.
and the roles individuals play in maintaining and challenging these systems. They go hand in hand, really, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, right. Like if we look at any society's infrastructure, any of them across the world, rich countries, poor countries, do we think we're ever looking at one that thrives on people being healthy? Maybe there's a few examples, but very few, right? There was an economist I saw on TV. I keep forgetting who it was because I've shared this example a lot. He was asked about it was more of a climate driven question, but someone was asking him, do you think it would be better to support a cycling economy in a city like major cities or over a driving one? And that might not sound like it has anything to do with abuse and how we treat each other. But his response was great. He goes, "Well, do you want my personal response or do you want my response as an economist?" Well, if anyone says that, clearly those are different answers, right? Otherwise, you would just answer. So he goes, well, personally, I'm for it, but as an economist, it's a disaster. And long story short, what he was saying was, he goes, well, if you take away cars, you take away the borrowing economy, because the number one thing people have to do to buy cars is borrow money, usually a lot of money, right? So you stop propping up the borrowing economy. So there you go. That takes a hit. People need a lot of insurance, both medical and car insurance. So you need less of both. You don't need car insurance at all, so that's gone. If you're not supporting cars and medical insurance, you need less of it because you have less cataclysmic disasters happening where people are dying. So
Mm,
have less of that, right? Yeah, you're encouraging people to be less stagnant. So
mm,
they're getting more exercise, they're getting more vitamin D, all that. They're probably focused more on their diet too, if they're doing things like cycling more and you've taken away the car economy, right? Like so his ending point was we set up societies to thrive on people being unhealthy, right? It would be bad economically if we supported one that all of a sudden overly encouraged people to be healthy. Right. And like that makes so much sense though, because it's so true. Like it's palpable. Yeah. And it's hard to like make sense of it. Like why
mm.
we do this to each other.
I think, I feel like, yeah, I don't have anything to say back, but yeah, it's just, I think that is so, yeah, depending on what hat you wear, there's different feelings, there's different responses, there's different ways of thinking and how you're going to process this. Like for him, it probably was very mathematical, very financial, very whatever it is. Yeah. Sorry. When you said medical insurance, it just threw me off. I was like, interesting. It just, oh, sorry. I was like processing that. Um,
Well, I think his point was like the overemphasis on that model is forces people to need a lot of resources and
oh
and
yeah.
to and
So,
to borrow a lot of right of things, which kind
Sorry,
of.
it was just the concept of medical insurance. From the UK, you don't really deal with that. So you're like, interesting.
Oh, right. Yeah. And when in the US, it's all privatized and it's a heavily exploited, yeah, mechanism. Yes.
We're going to move on to complex PTSDs. What are the defining characteristics of complex PTSD? And how does it differ from traditional PTSDs in terms of symptoms and causes?
It's a great question. So the main difference is um, regular PTSD is typically associated with more singular experiences, which is why you hear about it so much, for example, from war veterans, right? That their singular experience in a war largely has dictated um, their PTSD. Whereas the complex part is referencing how it can be several things, maybe lifelong things, already. So it's not pinpointed to a singular experience you've had. So usually for CPTSD, it starts in childhood. So for me, yeah, pretty much from the very beginning, I can recollect being yeah, made to feel like I didn't matter, my voice didn't matter. So yeah, so I have and I've been in hot zones and I've seen, witnessed terrible things. And I've been around very sensitive subjects with people from, yeah, extreme addictions or kids who have lost parents or, I saw a baby sitting in the middle of rubble during a firefight, in a hot zone, right? Clearly their parents were dead. They were covered in someone else's blood, and they're screaming in terror for someone to save them, a baby, right? Like you don't forget those things. So both things that have happened to me, like directly to me, but also experiences I've had seeing things happen to other people, right?
Mm,
That feel like they hit me just as hard and I carry all that with me has largely informed my CPTSD. It I have a hard time ignoring. We were talking about social justice. Those symptoms come out in that a lot. I have a really, really hard time depersonalizing experiences, right? So if I see something happening, whether it's happening to me or not, I feel like there's an inability to not do something or not say something, even if it puts me in danger. So I feel like it's also CPTSD has compromised my self-preservation instinct. I've had people say like, well, where's the fight or flight response? Like if danger is there, your instinct should be to remove yourself.
mm,
I'll be like, that's not my instinct though. I'm no hero, but my instinct is I either want to be helpful in this thing or my CPTSD is actually a part of encouraging me to walk towards the danger because I actually hope it ends. And I mean that in terms of like ideation. Like I would just want things to end. And instead of planning it myself, I think it kind of informs my psyche of I could just wait for danger to present itself and then walk towards the danger, if that makes sense.
yeah. It's so interesting because it's so similar. Like I've just had similar experiences, but I just want to explore CPTSD before I go in for our listeners. Um, but yeah, so complex PTSD was not discovered, but you know, the diagnosis was founded by a lady called, I think it was Dr. Judith Herman, something like that. And she is a American psychiatrist. I think she studied at Harvard. She did study at Harvard. And she was like, okay, I'm seeing patients with PTSD, but this is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
It's another layer to it, and it can't fit into the box of PTSD. The defining characteristics from of CPTSD is that emotional dysregulation. So individuals will experience really tense and unpredictable emotions that, is like persistent sadness, anger, or feeling of just emptiness, that numbness. And
Yeah.
they usually will have a very negative perception of themselves. So usually it's very deep rooted feelings of shame, guilt, and worthlessness.
Yeah.
And, like you said, people struggle with trust, that relationships and forming that secure attachment. And even though we feel like, our self preservation is sort of there, but it's not, because we feel disconnected from our surroundings or we experience gaps in memory. So there's that dissociation and detachment. That chronic, sense of threat, that hypervigilance and a persistent like sense of danger is very, very common for people with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of people, like you said, I'm just going to summarize, but traditional PTSD typically stems from a singular traumatic event, like an accident, an assault, and complex PTSD results from prolonged or repeated trauma, and it's usually often in childhood and sometimes within abusive relationships. And you beautifully discussed, not beautifully, like yeah, you wonderfully explained the impact it has on your identity, your emotional regulation, your relationships, where the traditional PTSD or PTSD tends to focus on more fear-based responses like flashbacks and hyperarousal, and that sense of shame or worthlessness are less pronounced in people with PTSD. They're both debilitating conditions, but maybe on two very different levels. For me, one thing that happened was this is one of the reasons I got also diagnosed with ADHD, because of that impulsiveness. But if I want to go kill myself, I would not even think about, oh, what would happen if I trigger warning. This is where the trigger warnings are. What would happen if I walk on train tracks? I will die. If I don't die, I'll be in a vegetative state. I will be severely disabled. I did not have the capacity to think in between. I want to die. This is the way that I'm going to die. That's it. As soon as I get the feeling, not, oh, it's going to build up. My feeling goes from 0 to 100 very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I don't care about anybody else. It's my life and I'm going to take it. If other people get impacted, that's fine. I'm disconnected. The empathy. Like, oh, if I did this, how would it, if I walk on the train tracks and I get hit by a train, how would it impact the train driver? How would it impact the people on the train? I don't care. That's what I want to do, and that's it. Or my back and my neck is very, very sensitive, and my head, at the back of my head. If you come anywhere close to me, or touch me, or make any unexpected movement to you, I will fight you. I don't care what your intentions are. I won't stop and think. I
Mhm.
feel like I'm in danger and I need to do whatever I need to do to protect myself. Or this is very personal. I probably everyone talked to my um therapist about it, but I've spoken to other people about it. When I'm having sex with someone, I don't enjoy it. So there's times where I won't enjoy it because I feel like, oh, it's linked to my sexual abuse, and then I'm like, I feel disgusted with myself. I feel like I need to wash this off, and I can't. And I feel like so detached from what I'm doing with that person, and I'm just angry at that person afterwards because I'm like, I don't understand this. I don't understand what is going on. I can't detach my memory from what I'm doing right now. I'm not getting sexually assaulted. I'm not getting raped, but I can't detach the two.
Yeah.
There's stuff like that, and people don't talk about it, but it's very, very intense. And a lot of people who end up in psychiatric wards, they have complex PTSD, or if they're a child, they have emotional dysregulation, which often ends up with a emotional unstable personality disorder diagnosis at 18, which I had, which is very common for people.
Mm.
People who are neurodivergent, they're likely to have complex PTSD. A lot of people in children's psychiatric wards, my personal and professional experience, is people who are autistic and have ADHD. They don't have one or the other. They most definitely have both.
Yeah.
And it's so, and that's what you see. Sorry. I just said a lot of things and I was like, should have thought about the impact. So,
No, no, no. It's I mean, thank you for sharing that too, because I feel a lot of the same things that emotional dysregulation makes it, and also the experience that comes from, having CPSDs, likely largely from different forms of mistreatment, means too, when we talk about all that empathy, we might put a lot of focus on how we put empathy out there, but if we're ourselves not used to receiving it, which is also part of how we formed having CPTSD, uh, then I think, yeah, to your point, it's we feel these very visceral moments where we're ready to be hurt, and we're ready to defend ourselves because we're used to being hurt. And so even things like, thinking about our end, um, we disassociate any empathy in that, oh, it would affect other people. And there are people that would miss us. And, and like for me, like, I mean, I'm a parent, even the idea of, well, I do have a child, like that's both a responsibility, but also I love them and they would miss me, and right, like there's so many components there. But in the moment, it's I carry so much pain. How do I make it stop? And that's the thing that's so hard to when CPTSD kind of informs these moments of emotional dysregulation. This is why I've been ostracized many times when I've gone kind of social justice warrior or whatnot and stood up. Because in those cases, I don't feel like I have a choice. It feels very instinctual. And it's largely a response of, well, no one ever did that for me. So if I do the same and don't speak up or don't try and fight back, it might as well just be over. Like, why am I still here then? So it feels like a tricky thing to explain to people who don't have CPTSD and don't understand its dynamics. Because I've had people say back to me, "Oh, well, I've gone through hard things too." And
that's the only thing that goes in my head. I'm like,
right, and maybe they're saying it to be dismissive, and maybe they're saying it because they think in some way it relates. It's insulting regardless. Uh, because we shouldn't just try and act like we can relate to someone who says they're literally sharing a clinical diagnosis. Uh, so advice to people out there: don't just say I can relate if you can't. Um, it's not helpful. But yeah, I do find it tricky too because medications don't always help either. Um, And so finding environments and people who aren't aggressive, who do feel like safe spaces, that can feel difficult, like hard to find. Like good people are in short supply. Uh yeah.
absolutely. I think, yeah, I feel like people don't realize how detrimental complex PTSD is.
Yeah.
They don't realize how debilitating it is. My life, because of my neurodivergence and my complex PTSD and my EUPD, costs, like, for example, we talk about it financially, cost me £1,000 more than what I earn and what I get in benefits to look after myself and meet my needs. And that's no luxuries, that's just basic living.
Yeah.
Just for me to survive, go to work, go to my appointments, all my medical stuff. And it's so expensive. And that takes a lot of physical toll on you because you won't go out. you won't do this, or it will affect your mental health, then you go in a much deeper place. Can you discuss the impact of prolonged exposure to trauma and mental health, particularly for individuals in oppressive environment with a lack of compassion?
Yeah. Um, I mean, when I talk about my experience, because I mean, I know what it is to be environments that really lack any compassion, right? And are filled with abuse. But then my home life, in terms of my parents were two of the most supportive people in my life and still are. They never abused me, which is a typical scenario, right? That it starts with weak parenting. You know, your parents either are abusive or they don't do a good enough job keeping you safe, right? Protecting you from other forms of abuse. So mine didn't stem from that. So I have always had that as an anchor, right? To think back on and be like, well, at least I was shaped, with good messaging. Um, it hasn't always helped me in figuring out like how to better deal with it, but some people don't even have that. They don't have an anchor in their life where they can look back on and be like, well, I had some good direction here, right? They might have started with trauma from the very beginning. And to what you've shared too, sometimes it comes from places and people who we should be able to trust the most. So so then what ends up happening is if we can't trust, if what we're told is, oh, family is more than friends, like family is for life. Friends might come and go, families for life. I mean, you hear that all over the place and in so many cultures, uh, right? So, but if your association with even something like family is, even if it's just one person, one dynamic within that, that's all it takes. It doesn't have to be everyone ganging up on you. Even if it's just one episode or one person, how can we ever possibly figure out what a healthy environment looks like when what we've been told should be the best one has been toxic and full of abuse, or an abuser was allowed to thrive in an environment, even around other people who we felt gave love and support and all of that, right? That's the other one that's wild. When people don't want to upset the herd, this happens a lot in situations, which is why it also goes largely unseen, is you hear oh, well, there's always a few bad apples in a tree.
Mm.
Like, no. Like you you have to acknowledge it though. Like you can't just say, oh, well, some bad things happen, but we can't upset everything because some bad things happen, or there's one bad seed, in there. It's like, right, but that will poison everything else if it's not acknowledged though. And I think that's for a majority of us, that's what happens more than kind of these extremes is the complicity from people
Mm.
around us is almost as bad, maybe just as bad as the people who are directly abusive themselves, right? Because if then I think that informs also further our ability to trust and not trust. When the good people do nothing, right? That conversation, I feel like my CPTSD informed like perceptions, I think I'm actually harder on people who are adamant that they're good. I'm a good person. I hate when anyone says that. I'm a good person. It's like, are you? If you were, you wouldn't need to say it. Like, it would just be clear. It's like someone who says, trust me. You see that in movies all the time. Trust me. Oh man, if anyone says that to me, I'm already like questioning. Like, if you needed to say it, then clearly there's a reason you think you needed to say it. You're not already trustworthy enough. You needed to like be adamant. So it's I'm harder on people who like to put a lot of attention on being good. And it's like, well, not if you're allowing darkness to thrive. So if you're not willing to stand up and point out where it's not working, or I've just shared with you something that's not working, or someone that needs to be outed, so that health can come back to this environment, and you're not willing to do anything about that. It's hard as people who are already heavily emotionally compromised. Then you're like, what's worse? The person who does damage, but they're not really necessarily hiding the fact that they're a damaging person, or the person who supports damage or does nothing, but is adamant that they're a saving grace. Well, they both do tons of damage. That's what sucks, right? So it's a really tricky place why people with our condition often feel alone. You already feel largely alone in there being guilt and shame from going through what we've gone through. Oh, the world tells us, well, we must be weak if we're victims. Victims are weak. We're picked out by the predators. Predators thrive and survive because they're strong. That's the animal kingdom, right? So we should feel shame or guilt. And then we don't share it, and then we don't share it, and then people don't know about it, and then people don't know about it, and then no one can help us, and then we don't ask for help. Yeah, right. There's the vicious cycle, which abusers totally know happens, which is why they are empowered to continue doing it to more people. You know, I remember being locked in a locker for 4 hours one time. It was a locker so tight, I couldn't move my head and I couldn't turn any of my body. So I was like this, like my hands had to be like stuck up in my chest. And it wasn't just one person that locked me there, it was four. And all four were identified after the fact, but no one wanted to get their hands dirty to make a big deal out of it. So I was basically told, like, oh, well, you're not physically hurt, you're not physically harmed. But I was screaming at the top of my lungs for 4 hours until I passed out. The only reason someone found me is it had closed. That place had closed, and it was a cleaning person who came to do their job, and they saw me. I was unconscious. And the only response was, well, you seem to be physically okay. Nothing's broken. You don't need to go to the hospital, right? Therefore, we're all good. Everyone can move on. So then we wonder why we don't fight harder, when we have things like CPTSD. Like just surviving. You said it earlier, just surviving seems like enough of a task.
Absolutely. I agree. I feel like we're surviving. Even if thriving is this far, somebody's gonna push that down. Or some system's gonna push it down. Something is gonna get in the way. And people are like, you have to think positive, whatever, but it's a reality. I can think positively, I can wish for things to be a certain way, but I know reality. If I think positively and not realistically, I know how that's going to impact me. I'm lying to myself. I'm hoping for something and wishing for something, which might not actually happen. Before we move on, this is where we get really into the good stuff. But yeah, I, I didn't. I'm gonna be honest with you. I did not expect us to get into this. Yeah, because usually guests are very like, I don't know. This is interesting. I'm really enjoying myself. So, how might CPTSD manifest differently in empathetic individuals compared to those who don't identify as highly empathetic?
Oh, I mean, that's something I think about constantly, actually, as because I I feel that I'm someone who's highly empathetic, and
Mm,
on the Myers-Briggs test, which I encourage everyone to do, it's a really good one. The Myers-Briggs personality test. I'm an INFJ personality, which is kind of a counselor personality, and
mm,
so Not very common, but highly empathetic. So that totally makes sense for me. So coming from that perspective, uh, I think what manifests in me is a huge revenge fantasy, which seems like it would be anti-empathetic, right?
Mm.
To want swift justice against people who do wrong and destroy things, right? But that's actually born from empathy, right? We like empathetic people have a high sense of justice. We want to see it served. We want to see people who are hurt, who are neglected, um, receive just a response, right? And that's not necessarily punishment, right? But it's not to be ignored. And I think it's easy for highly empathetic people also to feel ignored. Like when you're that friend, I think everyone kind of has a friend in a group who they're usually a good listener, and so all the other friends will come to them and share their problems. And and then it can be easy for that person to never get to do the same, right? They don't really get a good listener in return, but they are the good listener for everyone else. So if you combine that with CPTSD, and then which really stems from compounding trauma, like it creates a huge inner conflict, I think. I'm constantly at battle with wishing swift justice on lots of people because your sense of where the empathy comes from is, well, I feel so much for other people, right? And I
Mm.
don't see that as a commonality amongst most people. Then, and then you're like, and if that's what brought me CPTSD, like if that's what brought so much of my trauma, is that I care and a lot of other people don't, it's hard to know what we're left to do with that, right? Other than meet other people in their pain. Um, I think it's a topic that has very few easy answers. It requires a really deep dive because I think empathy and justice go together, and then they don't necessarily work well together um, when you hit those kind of extremes. Uh, yeah,
So finding that balance really, it's like dialectical stuff. I feel like the people who are highly empathetic tend to have stronger reaction to injustices. And we've spoken about this previously, and I feel like, and that can not always be portrayed in a very healthy way.
yeah,
So when somebody's distressed, they might, I hate this term, but be aggressive, or they might be, I know that I can be that way. I know I can be very much, I can be I can be argumentative. I can be so many different things. And I think people who are not as highly empathetic, they can be that way. Don't get me wrong, but they also can be very much here. Yeah, this is not my problem. Yeah, this is whatever, and then shut down or be like,
yeah.
let me take a step back because this does not involve me.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention that part, it does, especially talking about where CPTSD comes into this in relation to empathy. Um, when you've experienced a lot of trauma, especially compounding trauma from different directions and different times of life, people can start to become numb, right? Emotionally numb, especially if you've been like victimized or just had many different experiences, right? So you start to kind of prepare yourself for more of it coming, right? Some people might even convince themselves they're destined to just be traumatized for life, right? And that's what's in the cards for them. So it's very easy to then become someone who's numb, right? And you do emotionally disconnect to your point. So when an
Mm.
empathetic person disconnects and either tries to become numb or just becomes numb because they've been hurt so much that you've kind of given up a bit, or you're emotionally distant because getting excited about things hasn't worked out very well most of the time. That's a huge thing to balance is how can you still care so much and yet you feel emotionally burned out, like you have nothing left to give. And I think that's when it's the easiest to also get agitated when you see, bad things happening. I'm almost always that person who like speaks up and I get very frustrated when I see things I think are wrong happening. And and I'm always wondering, why does no one else seem to care? And it's not necessarily that they don't care. They think my response to it is extreme,
Mm.
right? They don't, their response is, oh, maybe it happens all the time, or oh, it's not as bad as you're making it out. And it's like, well, from a perspective of an empathetic and CPTSD person, not I don't think anything comes off as small. Everything is kind of magnified,
Absolutely.
right? Do you think so?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like people often think, I know for me personally, and I've met with other people and worked with people who are often thought of as dramatic, as, extremists, as somebody who's an all or nothing person. But I think, and people think about all these things and be like, you're so dramatic, you're so whatever. But what's the reason behind it? And people don't go think that far. And I'm like, there's no point in pointing out a behavior if you're not going to address the behavior and the root cause of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, well, we're also taught, and I don't know if this is truly universal, but you know, especially from more wealthy countries like the US and UK, I know the culture is very much like, don't worry about other people's business, worry about yourself, try and get ahead, right? All that stuff, hustle, work hard, just focus on you. Like that's very much what I was, taught from the culture of where I grew up in the US. And so then also that vibe of, oh, well, if it doesn't really affect you, why do you care so much? Right? Oh, you're talking about something that happened to someone else. But like, why is that any of your business? Like, and my first response is, does it have to happen to me for me to care? And for me, that's always a no, it doesn't. uh it's not necessarily about sticking ourselves in other people's business, but like if we see someone else being harmed in some way, right, then the instinct is that's not okay. Someone should say something. Someone should comfort the person. Someone should see if they can even stop or or hinder the abuse or whatever it is. And I think for so many of us, we're just taught don't don't put yourself in harm's way unless you yourself are already in harm's way,
Hmm.
right?
I feel like this is such a Western thing, though. It's a very much we're
Yeah,
individualists instead of collectivists.
yeah. That's why I was
Like,
saying. I think like UK, US kind of cultures, it's definitely hugely prevalent for us, right? Not necessarily everywhere.
it's, and I feel like that is such a downfall. I think, and people don't realize how negatively it impacts your life.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say that again. People don't realize how like negatively impacts your life, and how much like not being empathetic. It's not being empathetic. It's being human. You don't need to be high levels of empathy. You don't need to be like
right,
help everyone, sacrifice your life. Be that uh hero in a film. It's okay. It's absolutely fine. You need to be able to empathize with a situation. But like sometimes you can help people. Doesn't mean like, oh, if you're going to be in immediate danger, don't get involved. But like,
right.
but do something about it.
Well, and that's the thing is I think people are thinking they're constantly having to make a risk assessment at the
Mm.
time. But even when it's not putting you in any danger. So like in colleges, they would in psychology classes, they would always teach the Kitty Genovese situation. which was a woman was in like a courtyard or an alley of like an apartment complex. So clearly,
Mm.
lots of people lived right there, right? And she got attacked, uh, and was heard screaming and stuff. So it was very clear in the moment that people were taking notice. They could either see, they were in full view of many windows from a complex or multiple buildings, and people could hear. She was being very loud, and so it was obvious. And when the police, in the aftermath, when the police came around to question people, at least 30 people had said they either saw it happening or heard it. And guess how many people called the police?
None.
Like one, like the person who called. That's it. Like
Yeah.
they did a bunch of calls. And it wasn't necessarily, and it wasn't that people said, "Oh, it wasn't my problem." The biggest response was, "Oh, I figured other people were already helping," which is in
So
itself
she's
a
just
cop.
screaming for no reason then. Like, do you...
Well, right. But it's also, I mean, it's a cop out, right? It's,
Yeah.
oh, I'm assuming other people are helping. Well, did you do
Mhm.
anything to see closer, get a closer look, or call call police anyway, right? Or, to like do something. But most people wanted to abdicate any responsibility and say, well, I'm sure it was already being taken care of, so I didn't want to be a burden by getting in front of it. But it's an assumption, not a question.
Mm.
So I find that one interesting because it's not like that's a one-off. Most people, the majority of people, even in a real life situation where there was danger and someone needed immediate help, still the majority of people chose to do nothing. They had a choice. They were aware of what was going on. They chose to do nothing. That's what's hard. That's what I think when we're talking about empathy and CPTSD, that's what I think people like us, like we know that that happens and
Mm.
that's not acceptable. So, like, we don't wait for things to escalate when we see things going wrong. We know the ramifications because we've been on the receiving end of trauma, possibly a lot of it. So we know what happens, and we know what happens when people do nothing.
Mm. I think it's that like you it's like those people who often have PTSD, they often go into roles that help other people.
I mean, it's true, absolutely. Because you can relate, and I mean, the same is true with addicts. A
Mm,
lot of addicts, when they get in recovery, they end up wanting to be helpful to other people to recover and even get into that work.
absolutely. And it shouldn't be like the way that, oh, um, I have to be I want to be the person that I never had.
Yeah.
I don't, and I feel like that's the problem with society. People often wait for somebody else to do something, somebody else to take care of the problem. And that's never is a solution. And
Well,
it just creates more harm than good.
sure, because you could be waiting for a long time. And
Mm,
if there's immediacy, like time sensitivity, then you don't necessarily have a long time to wait for someone to just volunteer, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. But it's hard not to feel judgy and like hard in your heart, thinking that for some reason being an empathetic person means, you're in any way better or, like you care more.
Mm.
Um,
I feel like the reality is, I think people who are empathetic do care more
I mean,
majority of the time.
exactly.
And I think it's the thing is right, I've if I understand people don't want to put themselves in harm's way. I understand that people do not want to put themselves at risk, but I do not condone. Not maybe condone is not the right word. I do not support when people are bystanders. There's things that you can do whilst being safe. Like we, use example of the girl. you can call the police. You
Yeah,
know, just because one person calls the police doesn't mean the police is going to turn up.
sure.
You know,
And it also
there's so
doesn't,
many situations, and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, I think about this when I work for local authorities. I think about this when I work in NHS, when I access services, whatever it may be. How did these people go to sleep at night? Because I know if I've heard when I was younger, it was foxes. They were screaming at night. But when foxes scream, it sounds like a girl
oh yeah, it
screaming
sounds awful.
in
Yeah,
distress. And
yeah.
I remember I was what 8 to 10, some age between that, and I've never heard a fox scream before. And I
Hmm.
woke my parents up to be like, "There's this girl in danger. You need to help her." And if I,
Wow.
as an 8 to 10 year old, I can do that,
Yeah.
as an adult, what is your excuse?
Oh, there is no excuse. Yeah. Because there are ways to help. Yeah, to your point, that don't put you in any danger at all. Right. I mean, even when people call the police, for example, you don't have, they'll ask you to identify yourself, but you don't have to. It's really just for their assistance, but you can still report seeing things anonymously, right? Give some details, and if you don't want to volunteer anymore, you can give details and hang up. You're doing just by doing anything, it's better than nothing. And a lot of people just simply do nothing. Um, it reminds me too of and there are a lot of statistics on this of the drop off on empathy based on knowing the person versus not knowing them, right? And the further like the 6 degrees thing, right? The further away, their connection to you is, literally the drop in empathetic responses is huge, right? So if it's a family member or a friend, obviously there's a lot of care. Like that's an intimate dynamic that you have with them, even if you're not best friends with a family member, but that's still an intimate closeness. You still end up caring what happens to them, and other family members that are close to you are going to care too, right? So there's like a community of empathy in some way. But if it starts becoming like, oh, someone at my school that I don't know, okay, there's a connection because we're in the same vicinity, but I don't personally know them, there's already a drop off. Then it's like, what if it happens to someone in like the city of London, a city of 10 million people? Oh, well, they live in the same city, so it's local news, but I don't know them. Then it's what happens to someone in another country, a country I've never been to, with a language that's different, maybe even a religion that's different, and other cultural practices, right? So everything is completely distant for you. Nothing. It's a crazy how the empathy drop off on the same questions. Like people are polled using the same questions. No, there's just very little response because you have no personal connection to it. And then it's how do we get people to care when things are happening to people we don't know? That like, do we have to know the person for us to care? And I think that's for me, that's the biggest difference between a truly empathetic personality and one that's not. Is we don't wait until something happens to us or something happens to our best friend for it to really bother us
Mm.
and want to do something.
Yeah. When I deliver training, you know, those stuff, one of the trainings I do is very, very emotive. There's an exercise which can cause a lot of emotional distress because
Mm.
it literally forces you to be think like a child in care because of the nature of the exercise and the impact it could possibly have. And people get really distressed and people might get emotional, whatever like that. And maybe it's my autism that doesn't understand fully about emotions and human reactions and to the situations around them, what's happening and stuff like that. But also with my complex PTSD, I know I'm highly empathetic. I know, oh, they're upset. I need to help because nobody else has helped me regulate my emotions or deal with my emotions. And there's times where people will cry, but I'm like, oh, why are they crying? I would probably say it out loud, or ask someone because my autism is unable to comprehend. Because just because I don't find it emotionally upsetting doesn't mean I'm not curious about why it could upset someone. And I will try hold their hand if they want their hands held. Most of the time they do. maybe hug, get them something to drink or eat. And that's the level of empathy, it, that I think like it can be challenging. Not, I think with CPTSD or being highly empathetic, or just empathetic in general, comes with so many emotional psychological challenges as well. When you see someone in distress or discomfort, it's uncomfortable for you, it's distressing
Yeah.
for you. It's like I feel like I've got slapped in the face as well. Like you're just talking about it.
Oh, sure. I've had very visceral experiences where it also feels like a trigger.
Mm.
It can take you back. Seeing something happen to someone else can trigger you just as much, where you're reminded of how what that feels like. And then the impending, element of like you don't want other people to experience what you've experienced or f feel what you feel. So so that it makes that response uh yeah, really raw, right? And hard to hide it, and then so then when other people might say, "Oh, how come you're responding so much to this?" Like, did you know the person? That's my favorite. Did you know the person? And if you say, "Well, no, not really," or "No, not well," right? Then the follow-up is usually, "Oh, well, then why is this affecting you so much?" So So it seems for the average person, it is very much dictated on how well you knew the person to dictate how much you care. Because I'm almost always left with the same response of confusion when you say, I didn't know them at all, or I didn't know them well, but your response is very hard. It's hitting you very hard. And other people seem just confused, straight up confused on why it would impact you so much.
Mm. And it feels so alien to them as well, which and I'm like, and then the thing is, right, with my autism, I know a lot of the time, complex PTSD or EUPD, they can be like mistaken for autism as well.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I'm like, and people think people with autism lack emotional intelligence or they lack empathy, or people with CPTSD lack empathy because they've gone through extremely traumatic situations.
Right.
But those people are the most empathetic people.
Yeah.
For you, what do you think is like not you specifically, it could be you specifically, or the people you know, or your experience, or whatever it may be. What specific emotional and psychological challenges do you think empathetic individuals face?
Well, I think it's very easy uh, for people like that to navigate to each other.
Mm.
So, like, I had a really, really strong dynamic with someone who was very important to me, and they've also gone through a lot of trauma,
Mm.
and we really ended up meeting each other mostly in that trauma.
Trauma bonding.
Yeah, and it's not, and you realize it's not very healthy after a while because it also starts to bleed together, where you don't
Yeah.
necessarily know if you're feeling something based on them or based on yourself. It
Mm.
starts to really, really bleed together. So that's a tricky thing when you're coming across other people who share that same level of trauma and maybe empathy too. Um, but I think I've been around people who've been who are from places where they've gone through harder trauma than I've been through. So like I worked with these two guys in a hotel in New York in Manhattan when I lived there. And they used to think too to our point that I would get frustrated too much about things I would see or experience. And they were two highly empathetic guys. I love those guys. And I said, "Well, how come it doesn't seem to bother you as much?" And they both said, "Well, we come from war. So the things that we're experiencing here, that's That's nothing compared to where we were. And so one of the guys was from Kosovo and the other guy is Palestinian.
Mm.
And you don't have to do a lot of homework to know that, those are two very embattled places. Uh, right. And both those guys actually grew up in those places. So so that, made a lot of sense to me that their way of coping was to kind of wear it less on their sleeve, you know, hide it more, but they also have just experienced a lot, seen a lot. And I'm sure their families have too, right? So so that was, a bit, that didn't really change how I respond. I still am highly emotional in my responses, but it did give me a different kind of appreciation of on how, other people respond to trauma who are highly empathetic. Um, you know, I think it's, but I think it's hard to live in the middle no matter what.
Mm.
I think we end up either being kind of closed off and kind of numb to a lot of it. We either get to that place, and you can get to both spectrums at the same time, which might seem strange. Or you get to the one where it's hard to not be highly emotional. And emotional dysregulation is a huge part of CPTSD too. And so I know it's a problem for me, which is why I'm open about sharing that I have the condition with people, because I'm like, maybe that will help you inform you of why you're gonna see me respond to things, both positive and negative, in a big way, right? Even simple things as someone saying hi, I love it. It fills me with so much. So the positivity spectrum is feeling things very big, and the negativity spectrum is also feeling things very big. So I think that is a struggle though, when it feels almost impossible to ever live just in the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely does make sense. So I think the next question I'm about to ask is very much bespoke to the individual. I don't think there's one right answer. I think there's like answers that can be helpful. How can like friends and family best support someone with CPTSD, particularly if that person has the empathetic disposition?
Uh, so my best initial response is to don't ever say to someone like that, "What's wrong with you?"
Mm,
Whether they're a kid or an adult. I think it's a massive mistake that people make. They don't necessarily think they're doing anything wrong or insulting by doing that, but insinuating that by having a condition at all means there's something wrong with you is just going to make that person feel like, oh, I'm flawed. I'm 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 not just imperfect. There's something wrong with me. So I'm different than other people. I'm not as good. I'm a bad egg, right?
yeah,
Like it's and it's not like you have to tell that to people all the time, but I think it's a mistake.
mm,
And I think it's something that a lot of people conflate and think, oh, but it's innocent. You're just trying to understand. It's like, okay, but there's ways to do that. There's a tact to doing that, which doesn't make work to make the other person feel like they're a burden because they do have, hurdles that are unique to them
mm,
to get over, right? In order to function. Um, or be useful or whatever you want to call it, right? Um, yeah, I would say also for friends and family, just like being a good listener. Um, I think a lot of times people with conditions like ours are used to not being listened to.
yeah,
Um, I know I wasn't. People would just it would take me a long time to answer questions, especially when I was young. And I don't necessarily think it was because I wasn't like, processing things quickly. I just took my time. I wanted to be very thoughtful about my answers. And so people would just answer for me. And no one ever stopped anyone else from doing that or said, no, no, don't. like be patient, you know? And so if you're also combining that with people telling you that there must be something wrong with you, then the easiest thing to do, even from a young age, is to just stop talking. People, if you're made to feel that people are going to answer for you anyway, because clearly your answer is not the best one because you're flawed. That's why it all creates this connective tissue immediately that therefore if something is wrong with you, therefore your opinions are less valuable. Your knowledge is less valuable. What you have to contribute is less valuable. So then we wonder why people who need the most help sometimes have a hard time speaking up in their own defense to seek help. Because the people around us, even the people who are closest to us, do a great job of making sure that we don't feel empowered. And it's not necessarily intentional. That's being kind. But yeah, I would say those are the biggest mistakes that people make. It's not the super obvious evil or destructive things, where people are told, oh, you know, you are flawed. It's wrong. It's you're just a broken person. And there's lots of people who hear that directly and just get verbally abused, emotionally abused. Um, and so even the people who aren't doing that do all these subtle ways, which leads to the same place. It just leads to a lot of people, and this, then from my perspective, I know what it is to feel you feel inept, incompetent, unintelligent, incapable, unworthy, unvalued. So I'm 41 and I still get that demon on my shoulder telling me I am all those things. And I know it's because from the very beginning, all those things happened.
I feel like people often say, I can understand, which I find really, really annoying. No, you
Yes.
don't understand. Like, even when I, there's this young person that I work with who has gone through pretty much exactly the same things as me. They react similar to what I used to react like, but never how I once said, I understand. Because I'm like, I'm not taking away from your struggles.
Yeah.
We've gone through similar things, but our brains are two very different things. Sorry, we've gone through similar things. Our brains are not the same. We process information differently. We process, you know, what's going around. Our emotions, everything's so different. Our brain is wired differently. I don't understand what you've got going through, not even remotely, just because we've gone through the same experiences. And then, especially for somebody who's not gone through any experiences, to say I understand. I
Well,
even like I know right now I have a broken leg, and when people give me advice, and I'm like, I know you're like in my head, I'm like, I know you're trying to be helpful, but your body and my body works very differently.
yes.
Unless you're a medical professional,
Yeah.
yeah,
And well, and unless you're directly asking for advice.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just like,
Um,
don't just give me advice. I'll ask for it if I need it.
right.
And I think people need to realize that the person that you're talking to is different from you.
Yeah.
And even, yeah, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm like that with medical professionals as well. Unless I ask you to, just like, unless I'm in life or death situation, don't tell me. Like, there's some things I'm like, because I think, especially being a female, a South Asian female who looks the way that I do, I know that I'm gonna hear certain things, which is not relevant, which is
Sure.
not helpful, which is not even medically evidence, is your opinion based on the way that I look and the way that I present. And a lot of people do that. And I feel like being like the medical professional example is the most common thing that people experience. But people do that on a regular basis. People are just not in so much pain or agony. There's not something always on the line for people to realize and put two and two together. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, I think to your point, we're not always looking. So if we're willing to share something personal, that would make someone want to say, I can relate. But I don't think, I think people say that as in response because they think that's what the other person wants to hear. And I don't really think most of us, I don't think that's what we really want to hear. I think what we really want to hear is, I hear you. I'm listening, right? It's because usually the follow-up after I can relate is someone then gives an anecdote on why they think they can relate. And fine, and I'm sure we've all done that. I mean, I've done that. But I try to be conscious not to. What I try and say if I if I feel like there's an anecdote I could share is I know I can't I'll say something more like I know I can't relate, but as much as possible or like as much as I can understand, I would like to, and it might remind me of this, and then I might relay something, because I can sense that part of the goal of people, because I know it's my goal, is where can I try and meet you closer to where you are, right? To as an empathetic response. Instead of doing the thing like like on some TV shows where someone they'll finally get like a guest to share an intimate story, and then the host will be like, "Great," and they'll just like ask them to their next question. I was like, "You didn't listen at all," like, right? And so I do think for a lot of people it's a it's a clunky way of trying to create empathy.
Mm.
But I totally agree, and I love your point. It can feel disingenuous.
Yeah, I think that's really, which I don't know this, but I've not discussed this broadly with people, just with the select few. But the word sorry, I think that is very like dismissive at times. It's just trying to shut the conversation down because it's uncomfortable for people to sit with.
Well, especially if you don't follow it up with anything.
Yeah, uh, like for me, I'm like, oh my God, like if somebody tells me something, I'll be like you told me earlier that, you know, like you had a cold and it's not like going away. And I'd be like, oh, that must be annoying. That must be frustrating. I'm like trying to figure out how it feels and validating that and to be like, I'm sorry. Because that sorry is like, okay, you're just trying to shut the conversation down, or that's annoying. Like, sorry, it's not gonna fix this
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Well, because sorry doesn't like it doesn't exist in a vacuum,
Mm,
right? So it doesn't do, and usually like it feels like the time we do want to hear that word is when we feel like someone else is wrong, and we would like to just hear them say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." To me, that feels like the most useful time for that word to come out is, oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. You're wrong. I was incorrect. Like that seems to have a lot of value. But sorry in response to someone sharing something sad, that's like, I think we were touching on this before. That's like when a death happens.
mm,
And and the number one thing people say is, I'm sorry for your loss.
mm,
And in one of the most intimate and deepest moments of existence, right? Is there's an end. And so people are experiencing someone's end, and the only thing most people have to say is, I'm sorry for your loss, and there's no follow-up after that.
mm,
Right? So you're right. Like people do use it as this kind of, I don't even know what you'd call it, but yeah, it has a little value if you have nothing to say and contribute after that. You might as well not say anything. Sometimes. Yeah, and also if the same person says it enough too, it can also just start to feel like it loses its meaning, right? Um,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean but this is why this stuff takes work, right? I mean, we were talking about this before too, like the follow-up means so much more than what you initially said.
Mm,
Like when we ask each other how we are, how you doing? How's it going? How you getting on? The
Yeah.
initial response is always surface.
Yeah.
It's rare for someone to just jump in and be like, I'm having a terrible day and this and this and this happened and I would love to talk about it.
Mm.
No, you usually have to pry a little bit to get them there, right? People, even people who are keen to share.
Mm. I think I think it's actions that are more important. Like you said, like the word sorry for me is like when somebody acknowledges what they've done. But even then I'm like, I need an action to follow up with it. I know when my friend told me her grandmother died, it didn't affect her, but it affected her mother. And I sent flowers and I sent food. I can be, hello, how are you? What can I do for you? Usually people are like, no, nothing, I'm fine. That's the usual response.
Right.
Or people like say it with the intention they know that the person is going to say nothing. So, and it's like, yeah, I think that was part of being empathetic, but I feel like some, it's sometimes people, I feel like those who may be a bit more, I don't want to be not self-centered, that's not the right word, but more keep themselves at the forefront. They need to
Mm.
think about, if you were in that situation, what do you want somebody to do for you? Because let's be honest, most situations people are in, you're going to be in that situation one way or the other at one point in your life.
Yeah.
For example, if you're a female, at one point in your life, you're going to get sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
That's just reality. It's
Um,
rare if you don't, you know.
yeah.
And there's and then I think that was a bigger example, but you would want somebody to interact with you or respond to you in a certain manner.
Yeah.
The last question that I have regarding this topic is, everything we said cannot happen without creating a safe space for individuals to share their experiences with complex PTSD. What do you think is the significance of that? And achieving that, what will be the impact of achieving that?
I mean, first off, you can't have a safe space if even one person refuses to participate, right? Like, because then anyone anyone could feel that the fear is then coming from the one who doesn't share, right? Even if you have 20 people in a room and 19 of them are sharing, if one ends up acting like a brick wall and doesn't show any vulnerability, guarantee you at least half the room will refuse to share. There has to be transparency, otherwise it doesn't feel safe. Because if it feels like if you're going to go to deep places, especially places that we're used to seeing weaponized, right? Especially when we're talking about like things like disabilities. Uh,
Mm,
that is easily weaponized against people, and that we're often seen as liabilities, not assets. So to create any safe space, like no one's gonna feel safe if they don't feel like everyone is making a silent agreement to share something, to not be a brick wall. It's not like you have to open up the gates and share everything, but share something. Share a little bit of vulnerability. That's the sign of I'm here. I'm here to engage. I'm here to participate. I'm not here to be a fly on the wall and not be willing to meet you at least part of the way. That's the hardest part. Like in the workplace too, it's I've given workforce talks where I focus on people in management not being brick walls. I'd be like, if you want people on your team to be honest, it starts with you, man. Like if you have an authority and you act like a brick wall and there's like zero vulnerability sharing at all, no one else is going to do it because it's not safe. It's the perfect scenario for people to fear anything they do share to be weaponized because no one above them on the hierarchy is willing to do the same. Right? Same thing with like open door policies. And that sounds like a work thing, but that's also a friend thing. Like If you make time, and especially if you know someone wants or needs to talk about something private or sensitive, you can't do the thing of, oh, well, my door's always open. Because how many people trust that? No, it's not a commitment. It's not a commitment of any real time. You make time. You schedule it. That shows a real commitment of care. Just like in a workplace, a boss can't go, we have open door policy. Come by anytime. We can talk about things you're concerned with. No one's gonna trust that. You might fear you're coming when you do come, you're coming at the wrong time. Oh, it's bad time. I'm not available. Come back later. When you've summoned the courage to be open and raw, and
Mm.
someone says, "Oh, you chose a bad time. Come back later." There's no commitment, right? So that's why it is really hard to create a real safe space. Everyone, you have to get buy-in from everyone, or it doesn't work.
The one thing that I think I do in my management style, which I think a lot of people is a simple thing. I'm not saying this in a braggy way or a way to show off, but I think the one thing that I do is I would try and try to, tend to someone when they come to me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's some things that I can't just shut down and just go and speak to the person or whatever. So I'll be like, I'm gonna be finished in 10 minutes. I'll come to you in 10 minutes. And that's just one small sentence.
Hmm.
That's gonna be like, okay, in 10 minutes she's gonna come. We're gonna speak about it, we're gonna do whatever. And I feel like that's I do that with my friends, I do that at work. Is because somebody's come to you. They don't. Most people don't come to you for no reason.
Yeah, exactly. There's some
And
purpose.
there's purpose behind why they came, and they came. They picked you out of everybody they could have gone to, and I think just to honor that and to acknowledge that is so important because I think everybody gets busy in work, in life. Sometimes
Yeah,
you just need to take a step back and acknowledge, not acknowledge, be aware of the situation around you, which is difficult to do. The world is very, very much fast paced, especially if you live in London. You know,
yeah.
it's on a
No,
different level of fast paced. Um, but yeah, taking that step is really, really important. Um,
well, yeah, it gives a respect to it. You can't have a deeply rooted conversation and treat it as something where you're like, oh, I got like 5 minutes for you. You know, there's not like a lot of respect in that.
Absolutely. I think respect comes in so many different forms. It doesn't mean being formal and being a yes man.
Yeah.
It's it comes in so many different ways, and it's so important to find how it suits different people and how it meets that need. And I feel like, yeah,
Well, I mean, we touched on it earlier. This is why highly empathetic people end up becoming a vehicle, sometimes at work and with friends, for other people to come to. So, like you said, when other people choose you, whoever you choose to come to, right? They chose to share with you for a reason, and and highly empathetic people end up kind of uh being
sacrificing.
noticed. Yeah, like, and because they're noticed usually um more than others, that, oh, they're willing to listen, they're willing to take time there, and they can handle it. They can handle a lot of emotional weight. They seem to do okay with it. Um, it's just because we hide it well. Like we are used to taking the brunt of a lot of emotional stuff. Um,
I think often the thing is, I feel like we give so much, we fill other people's cups, but we don't fill our own.
Good way of saying it. Yeah, yeah, that's accurate.
I think
Uh,
as that needs, it's like I think it's that needs to be prioritized, and I think that's yeah. The people who give a lot needs to prioritize themselves because you can't help other people if you can't help yourself. Easier said
Well,
than
but that goes right back to the question you asked me earlier, talking about like when people instill this idea that there's something wrong with us, regardless if we have some kind of diagnoses that we're referring to, like you could be anyone, but that also like reinforces this idea that, oh, well, we're meant to serve others then. We're not meant for any kind of authority.
mm,
Um, so I guess we're just meant to serve others. And that's noble. That's not a bad way to be, but that can go to an extreme, kind of to your point, where then we end up giving it all away and we
mm,
kind of stop expecting anything back to the point where we just get depleted.
mm. I think to conclude this segment, I guess, what would you say that people who are highly empathetic or who are extremely giving need to do to prioritize their well-being?
I think the biggest thing, it's not easy. I'm still battling it. Uh, it's a daily work in progress, but is really set a mission, a personal mission of finding your self-worth, discovering your self-worth and telling yourself that. Um, because I know that it is magnified for people who especially are highly empathetic and on top of it have conditions um, uh, that yeah you doubt your self-worth because we're not treated as important or as valuable for the most part in society uh, even to the point where oh, empathy is considered weak in some circles. Oh, good for you, you care. Right. So if we can't, so I think it all starts and ends there. Like if we can't, no one else is going to be able to do it for us. We have to be able to, and this is why it's not necessarily an answer because I still know it's a daily challenge to really find our value and our purpose and tell ourselves that like integrate that thinking daily that we're valuable, we are worth the effort, like we have purpose, we have plenty of knowledge and skills and things to give into the world. um but because after that then we can function in a way where we're not um, making ourselves beholden to what other people are putting out there. Um, and I think it's a tricky place to go because in a lot of the infrastructure we've set up, um, we're told that uh, authority and power is designed for others. It's not meant for us.
Reclaim that power, right?
Yeah, right. So that even means like power over our own, ability to just thrive and have a healthy life and be good and practice self-care. I mean, there's power in that, right? So if we're kind of made to feel that we've basically, abdicated all power, uh, then yeah, then there's no wonder that that's the biggest thing. I don't have a lot of answers beyond that because I know that it's hard to accomplish very much if we can't accomplish that. And I know that's probably the single biggest hurdle I deal with in life is trying to still find and convince myself I'm valuable. There's a reason I'm here. I'm not incompetent. I'm not inept.
I think that's such a vulnerable place to end. And thank you for being so vulnerable. We spoke about so many different things today. What inspired you to pursue this topic and share it with our listeners?
Um, I mean, in terms of, well, the CPTSD part is something that I've clearly had for a long time and only sought a diagnosis now. I received my clinical diagnosis like a year ago at 40 years old. But clearly it was not a new phenomenon.
Mm.
uh, for me. Um, so I have found talking about these things, so diagnosis or not, that's not why I've felt compelled to speak about these things. And, because being an empathetic person isn't also not a new phenomenon, right? It's, you're kind of either born that way or not, I think, in a way. Um, uh, I think it's good therapy, to be able to share and be candid in public. Um, I mean, whether that's, on a radio show or a podcast, doesn't have to be that, but just in any kind of public way, right? With others. Um, I think it's really healthy. Uh, and I want other people to learn, like we were talking about. I don't want other people to feel like I have felt like, or to feel that they're trapped or that no one cares, or that even when we do share, people still misunderstand. Well, maybe we should share more then, and maybe people will better understand, or at least understand the nuances of how we function. I've become much more comfortable just telling people straight up, oh, maybe are we not communicating well? Well, maybe I'm unorthodox, and I can help you understand maybe why I come off as unorthodox, you know, right? Or atypical for someone else to understand, right? And that feels good to feel like it's okay, especially if you're receiving energy back, in conversation from someone else, that they're not responding with like, oh, that's weird, or right, or oh, this is why you're so strange, or this is why it's hard to work with you, or whatever, like but if you're willing to be more candid and be vulnerable, like, um, yeah, I just hope other people feel a bit empowered, maybe learn from it and feel like maybe they'll be okay sharing a bit more too.
Looking back on our conversation, what do you think is the most important takeaway or message you want our audience to remember?
Um, I mean, there's a lot of takeaways. Uh, I mean, if there's a real singular one, um, I really want to implore people to ask questions before they assume, about anyone. It doesn't matter if you think, they've got CPTSD or anything like that. I think we have a tendency to assume things about people before we ask questions, and
Mm,
we're afraid to ask questions. And
definitely.
I really want to implore uh, people to do that, uh, because I also am okay with people asking me hard questions, uncomfortable questions, and I'm okay answering them. It might be emotional. I might even cry a little bit. I'm a crier. But but it's okay. I would rather people be willing to go there than hide from it and feel like they're just, what do they call it? Walking on eggshells, avoiding uncomfortable conversations. No, I'd rather people be willing to go there. That feels more honest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there any thing you'd like to add or any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Um, yeah, I mean, actually, I guess my last thought is I was wrong. I was wrong earlier. Empathy is not just something you're born with. I really encourage. Some people are definitely born with a higher kind of magnitude, of it naturally, I think, but it's definitely something that can be developed.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was wrong to say that. I really want to encourage people to think about it, because when we talk about changing the world, how are we going to change things? How are we going to make things better? Empathy is like, everyone should be able to embrace it to a degree. If we can't do that, we're not going to get people to care about people who aren't us, or,
Mm,
or don't exist in our bubble, you know, our group of friends or whatever. And it doesn't mean you have to be someone that instantly, just wants world peace and justice for everyone. Like, no, I mean, start by being more empathetic with the people you do know, sure, with your friends, you know, and then I love this. I had someone challenge me. They said, I challenge you to talk to a stranger.
Mm.
Just strike up a conversation with a stranger. Right? Even if it doesn't go that far, make the attempt. It's scary, isn't it? Right? But try it. You might be surprised. And I did, and it was scary, and I ended up getting into a few really great conversations because
But
you're
being
taking it.
uncomfortable,
Yeah.
you come up with something out of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I stopped you.
No, but that's a yeah, exactly. And it's that's a great path to improve your empathy is uh taking you're first you're taking a chance, right? A risk. And what's the real risk? The risk is, oh, they don't really respond, so it feels like a rejection. Well, you didn't know them anyway, so how hard could you really take that rejection? They don't know you. You don't know them. Maybe they just are uncomfortable with people they don't know, right? So you're not really risking very much. And the flip side is maybe you get a good conversation. And the best flip side is maybe, shoot, you might even make a friend. That can happen, so, but it just takes that hurdle. It's like walking into a room. I guess my last bit is I'm not someone who will ever be comfortable just walking up to people and being the first one to speak.
Mm.
So, uh, so, so that can mean people think you're really shy. But if someone talks to me, I will be a chatterbox with them all night, right? So it is. It's just that first step. If we can get that first step, I think that's a huge path to building empathy for anyone.
Are there any upcoming projects, events, or resources you'd like to share with our audience? And where can our listeners find you or connect with you to stay up to date with your work?
Uh, yeah, I mean, right now, helping develop this citizens assembly project, called One World or None. And it was started by Jamie Kelsey Fry, and it has people like Brian Eno involved and like Trail Mix Games. And we're trying to encourage people on just practicing what healthy discourse and debate and democracy looks like through the practice of citizens' assemblies. Um, so that's a really cool project, and helping to produce a documentary on Earth Elders, the Earth Elders, which are indigenous leaders around the world. Um, and then people can find me on like LinkedIn or um, well, that's probably the main place. The main place. I'm not hugely on social media. Um, it was uh, an unhealthy space for me. But yeah, that's the best place, and I'm easy to find. You can Google me, and there's um, yeah, there's stuff like that. You can find other articles I've um uh been in if people are interested in hearing more like of me jabbering on.
Finally, what is one thing that you're grateful for today?
Uh, I'm grateful for you, that's for sure. Thank you for
Oh,
having this
thank you.
conversation. And for having these kind of conversations with other people. It's
Mm.
important, really. Yeah, I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful for um to also just feel that there's a safe space. I mean, talking about safe spaces, right? Like you've created a safe space here where we can have this conversation. So I just am grateful for wherever there are safe spaces where people know that they can be candid and be open and connect to people on a human level without some fear that it's going to be used against them. That's also what compels me to like keep sharing um, and it just makes me feel a lot of grace. Yeah.
Thank thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for joining us for this enlightening conversation with Ben Wiebe, where we explored the intricacies of empathy, the pervasive challenge of apathy, and the deep-seated impact of CPTSD in a world often unwilling to acknowledge its system of abuse and oppression. Ben's insights reminds us that while it can feel isolating to be an empathetic soul in a sea of indifference, our voice matters. Together we can foster connection and advocate for change, turning our struggles into powerful catalysts for awareness and action. As you carry this conversation with you, I encourage you to reflect on your own journey. How can you show empathy not just to yourself but to others navigating similar challenges? Remember, every small act of kindness contributes to a larger movement for compassion and understanding. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with your friends and family and continue the dialogue in your own communities. Let's amplify these conversations so those who feel like islands can find their way back to shore. Stay iconic. Until next time.